Hello and welcome to World Traveler Commentary, where we cover interesting events happening around the world with relatively irregular and infrequent commentary. Now, today I'm talking about Air India Flight 171 and the crash at Ahmedabad, India, on its flight to Gatwick. And this is a very uncomfortable video for me to make because I'm actually going to be going up against somebody who I consider to be an industry giant, namely Greg Feith. I'm going to be explaining why I believe that he's wrong, but I'm also going to explain why I do believe that the possibilities he's raised will in fact be reviewed by investigators. So please pay close attention to this. First of all, especially given all of this, I feel like it's important for me to go over where my credentials are and where they're not. My actual formal education is in the field of history. My professional career has been in IT, particularly in very, very high-intensity environments. So we're talking about sort of massive IT scale and things like that. And one of the things I've been trying to do is to bring into the field of IT a lot of the understandings of human error, which have been developed in aviation, firefighting, and medicine, in order to improve our ability to prevent and resolve outages, for example. Now, what this means is that when it comes to aviation accidents and investigations, I'm definitely still that armchair amateur, but when it comes to questions about human error, I've learned a hell of a lot. Right? And because I've learned a lot of this in these areas, this is sort of where I feel like I have the most to contribute. I've also worked with a whole lot of IT environments where various technical faults occur. And so while I'm not an electrical engineer and while I'm not an aerospace engineer, there are certain things that I can say about like the theories of technical failures in this flight. Now, it's also really important to recognize where the investigation is at this stage. I'm going to go into that. I think people are very much jumping the gun here. And then what I'll do is I will go through, I'm going to go through what the preliminary report says in terms of its timeline. And I will then go through what I think are sort of the major three theories about what happened. And I will be going through them from what I see as the least likely to the most likely, and I'll be covering arguments for and against them. I'll also leave some thoughts in terms of what investigators could find that could change my mind in terms of what might be the cause. Because I think it is extremely important that everybody looking at this, in fact, does maintain an open mind, and that we very strictly separate what we know from what we infer. Right? Anytime you investigate anything, especially where there's a possibility of a technical fault or a human error or something like this, it's important to keep an extremely open mind about what might have happened until you have all the pieces in order. And it's very, very clear to me, based on the writing in the preliminary report, that the investigation by the Indian authorities has not really reached the stage of trying to draw causal connections between all of the different pieces. I'll go into why I say that. So, on to the timeline. All times here are UTC, and I think India, if I remember right, is 5.5 hours ahead of UTC. So if it says 5:47, I think that's like 11:17 India Standard Time. But at any rate, so 5:47 UTC, the flight, the accident aircraft. And I'm still referring it to as an accident for reasons that will become clear later. The accident aircraft arrived from Delhi. The crew initially made a fault report for stab position XTCR, which, from what I understand, is probably the stabilizer position transducer. I would expect this to be part of the aircraft's trim system. Then at 6:25, the next item in the timeline occurs, which is that the crew arrives at the airport and they are given a breathalyzer test, which clears them for duty. At 6:40, then, the maintenance personnel release the aircraft after troubleshooting the problem report, and they release it for flight. At 7:25, the crew arrives at the gate, and 7:40 was the scheduled departure time. At 7:48 and 38 seconds, then, the CCTV records the aircraft beginning its actual departure from the gate. At 7:55 and 15 seconds, they receive their taxi clearance. They taxi to runway 4, and then they backtrack along the runway 4 to the end so they can turn around and use the whole runway. At 8:07 and 33 seconds, takeoff clearance is given. And then at 4 seconds later, so 8:07 and 37 seconds, the aircraft begins its takeoff roll. Now, 4 seconds is basically enough time for the pilots to read back the clearance and to set the throttles for takeoff thrust for the engines then to spin up and the aircraft to start moving. So that timeline all, again, indicates efficient crew, an efficient crew working together. Nothing unusual at that point. Remember, the first officer was pilot flying. Captain would have been pilot monitoring. This will become very important as I get into hypotheses. At 8:08 and 33 seconds, V1, which is the decision speed, V1 is basically the point where you can safely abort takeoff and still not overrun the runway with a basic safety margin. So at that point, basically, you're committed to the takeoff. So at 8:08:33, V1 is reached, and what's called the rotation speed, or VR, is reached 2 seconds later at 8:08:35. This is an indicated airspeed of 155 knots. So at this point, you would have seen rotate. The pilot flying, in this case the first officer, pulls back slightly on the yoke, and the airplane starts to fly away from the runway. Now, 4 seconds after that, the weight on wheel sensors indicate that there is no longer weight on wheels, and the aircraft is airborne. So, here's where things start to happen. At 8:08:42, okay, the aircraft reaches its maximum speed of 180 knots. And at this point, one or possibly both engines are transitioned from the run position on the fuel cutoff switch to the cutoff position. In other words, fuel is no longer being supplied to the engines. They stop working. They stop accelerating the aircraft, and it starts to decelerate. Now, I say one or both because it says there is a 1 second gap, but we don't have timestamps on either of those, right? And the reason why I say one or both here is that the engines are what are accelerating the aircraft. If you switch off one of them, the airplane still has the power to climb away. And so the question becomes, what's the relation of the maximum speed to the cutoff switches? And this is actually going to be a big issue when I talk about hypotheses and where I'm critical of a couple of people who have been making a lot of commentary in this area. So at 8:08:45, so 3 seconds after it reaches maximum speed, the engines are now below idle thrust. In other words, fuel's been starved from them, and the engine rotation speed is now low enough that it's below what would happen if you pulled the throttles all the way back to flight idle. 2 seconds later, at 8:08:47, the ram air turbine is now supplying hydraulic power. And 5 seconds after that, so 8:08:52, this is 10 seconds after the engine switches, one or both are transitioned to idle, no, transitioned to cutoff. The first one for engine 1 is now transitioned to run. At 8:08:54, the APU door opens. This is the auxiliary power unit, and basically it's a small gas turbine similar to a jet engine, which supplies electrical, hydraulic, and other power to the aircraft in order to power the systems. So it's now starting up. At the same time, they're starting to try to relight engine number 1. Okay? At 8:08:56, so 4 seconds after the first engine was set up, the second one is now flipped to run. And at this point, the preliminary report does indicate that the engine's exhaust temperature was rising, consistent with the relight, and that the engines were spooling up, but not fast enough. 8:09:05, there's an indication that a pilot, presumably the captain, I'll get into why, but it's not mentioned, says, "Mayday, mayday, mayday." Nothing else is recorded in the interim report. No, in the preliminary report. There's no interim report. The air traffic control asks for the call sign and gets no response. Instead, the aircraft is observed to crash at that point. Now, the other thing is, after the switches are transitioned to cutoff at first, there is a recorded conversation in the cockpit where one unspecified pilot asks the other one, "Why did you cut off?" And the other pilot says, "I did not cut off." We're going to get to that. I think that's a really important point. Now, one of the very important points here is that I don't think that the accident investigation has progressed far enough to actually establish causal relationships. And I say this because there is the point where they say immediately after the flight reached the maximum airspeed indicated airspeed of 180 knots, that the fuel switches were flipped to cutoff with a 1 second gap. Now, the basic way in which anybody's going to read this is that this happened after it reached the maximum speed, right? However, there is an open question in my mind here about whether the aircraft would continue to accelerate once the first engine was cut off, right? And I don't know the answer to that. That's something that I would certainly ask 787 pilots, if there are any here listening to that. But like one of the things where I think the flight safety detectives, in particular Greg Feith, is factually wrong, and I'm saying that very specifically, is that he puts a 1 to 2 second delay between reaching maximum speed and cutting off the switches. Okay, now I'll link to their videos here because I think they are worth watching. They do a fairly good job of breaking down the timeline, but in this particular case, their timeline has to be wrong, or something else dramatic has to be happening. If the aircraft achieved its maximum speed 2 seconds before the fuel switches were cut off, then something else must have been dramatically wrong, especially given that the investigation did indicate that the throttles were in the full forward detent position for the entire flight. This would indicate something else, okay? So that's an issue. However, because this is their decision to add that a couple of extra seconds by parsing the report in a way in which doesn't, in my view, make complete sense, I'm inclined to say that this is their error rather than an indication of something else going on in the aircraft, okay? So I'm just going to say that I believe that they're actually wrong on their timeline. And I think that there's an open question about the relationship of the maximum speed to the cutoffs in the preliminary report, which indicates to me that they may not have started to try to fully build causal chains yet. That's really important when we get to questions about what happened. Okay, so now there are three major theories going around in relation to the crash itself. Okay, the first, and I'm going to cover these from what I believe is the least likely to what I think is the most likely. I'm also going to talk about why I think it's premature for the accident investigators to be eliminating any one of these at this point. But I'm going to indicate why I think some of them are less likely than others. The first one is some sort of a technical fault that caused both engines to fully roll back, and, for example, the fuel cutoff switches to be mistakenly understood to be in the cutoff position. Now, the first thing you have to understand is that these switches are very well designed, they're very robust, they form separate and redundant parts of the fuel control system. So each engine has its own fuel control computer, it has its own fuel control switches, etc. So in theory, what affects one switch and one system should not affect the other one. Okay? However, there's of course a big however here. There are two things you have to understand in why I'm not willing to completely rule out that theory. Okay, I'm willing to come close. I'm willing to say it's highly unlikely, but I'm not willing to completely rule it out. The reason I'm not willing to rule it out are two basic reasons. The first is that to my knowledge, there is no direct reporting of the fuel control switch position to the the flight data recorders, the EADR. These are joint boxes that do both flight data and cockpit voice recorder. Now, what this means is that the results then have to be digitized and stored electronically here, right? So the question is, how exactly is this monitored? Is there some possibility of some transformation of the values somewhere between where they happen on the switches and where they get acted on? Again, those come through redundant systems, so it seems to me highly unlikely that you'd have two simultaneous or near simultaneous faults. In fact, the fact that these are near simultaneous makes it, in my view, much less likely that it's a technical fault than if they were simultaneous, right? So we have seen cases, right, where redundant systems are taken out by singular events. A really good example from a long time ago, and aircraft are, of course, more robust these days, is United Flight 232, where an engine explosion in the tail engine, in fact, took out 3 redundant hydraulic systems and left the airplane with no normal means of control, right? Now, obviously, we build aircraft now to survive a single engine explosion, generally, but or at least not to be as susceptible to that. But at the same time, you still have the fact that every engineered component is going to have environmental criteria which have to be met for it to continue to operate. And for one reason or another, it's quite possible that some singular event could take both redundant systems out of their operational parameters, right? Now, the reason I think that this is most unlikely, okay, is that if you had such a singular event, I would expect the failure to be simultaneous between both systems, okay? Instead, it mentions a 1-second gap. The second issue is that the engines are transitioned from cutoff to run 4 seconds apart. This suggests, to my mind, that in fact the fuel switches are moved at that point from cutoff to run, and that 4-second delay has to be a manual delay in order to allow one engine to relight, probably verify that the exhaust temperature is starting to rise, flip the other one, right? So this strikes me as something which would require that the physical switches moved, given the design of the switches, that you have to lift them out, move them across basically a bar, and then the spring comes down and locks the switch in place. Again, makes it highly unlikely that there's anything other than a manual movement of those switches. However, obviously the investigators will be looking closely at those switches. They will be looking closely at anything electronic connected to those switches. And if they find some sort of a fault, of course, that will be in the final report. The second theory going around, which I would rank more likely than the mechanical or computer failure, technical failure hypothesis, is the pilot suicide hypothesis. And I'm actually going to call it pilot murder-suicide, because if you're flying an airliner with a large number of people on it, and you decide to end your own life by crashing it, you're at least understanding that you're ending the lives of a large number of other people as well, right? So let's call it what it is. Let's call it murder-suicide. Now, I'm not saying that these events don't happen. We have 2 very, very well-documented cases, and we have several suspected cases. I'm just grabbing my notes here because I don't use a teleprompter, so I do want to make sure I get my facts correctly. The 2 completely confirmed cases that we have are the Germanwings Flight 9525 case and the LAM Mozambique Flight 470 case, which happened a year earlier. Now, in both of these cases, what happened was a pilot locked his colleague out of the out of the cockpit, and then proceeded to set the autopilot to crash. Both of these events happened from crews, and I think that's actually really important. I'll get back to why in a moment. But the basic implication here was that, left alone at cruise, a pilot, was able to, lock a colleague out. Now that we have nice reinforced doors after 9/11, the other pilot couldn't get in. Now, we also have a number of suspected murder-suicide by pilot cases, right? And these include Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, which is believed by many to, again, we don't have the wreckage, but it's generally assumed that the majority evidence is that the pilot may have deliberately flown the flight out to sea in a way in which it eventually crashed into the Indian Ocean. There's also China Eastern Flight 5735, which departed from cruise shortly before beginning its descent. The NTSB, or I think it was, said that this appeared to be deliberate. The Chinese authorities have not said anything, but they've said now that continuing the investigation would potentially cause civil unrest or something. So in this regard, while it's not completely confirmed, I'm assuming that they found something similar to what the NTSB found. Then we also have Egypt Air Flight 990, and we have Silk Air 185. Now, every single one of these cases, suspected or confirmed, from the last several years, has had its crash sequence begin in cruise phase. Okay, there has never been, to my knowledge, a deliberate crash of an airliner from takeoff or landing phase. So if that were the case, this would be the first. Now, Craig Fife has basically latched onto this, I think, because of feeling like he wasn't listened to properly with the Silk Air investigation, and basically believes that this is the explanation, and therefore all of the facts are read to support this explanation. I think there are other readings of the facts that are not merely plausible, but probably more likely. But this explanation completely omits the fact that the overwhelming pattern is, if you have a crash and it's going to be a pilot murder suicide, it will almost always, or always as far as our record is to date, begin in cruise. Why does it begin in cruise? For two reasons. Number one, you have the opportunity to isolate the one pilot from the other. And secondly, and just as importantly, it's a low workload phase of flight. In other words, there's time on your hands to think, there's time on your hands to make radical decisions, there's time on your hands to there's time and there's intellectual energy, brain, and basically decision-making power. There's bandwidth in your brain available to actually make these sorts of decisions. Okay, so the fact that this happens during a high workload phase of flight seems to work against that hypothesis, at least to my mind. Okay, and so now what would change my mind about this would be if you had some other strong evidence that this had been practiced before. Because at this particular phase of flight, you're probably talking about, weight on wheel sensors going, you're starting to see a positive vertical speed. You say positive rate, gear up. That's about, that's 3 to 4 seconds right there, right? So if the captain had practiced, gear up, okay, I'm switching off the fuel switches. If there was some evidence of that, then I would accept a pilot suicide hypothesis, murder suicide hypothesis. But at this point, we are so far from that it doesn't seem likely to me in this particular case. Okay. So now on to the third hypothesis, which I believe is the most likely. Okay. Very early on, one of the pieces of speculation was reaching for the landing gear and retracting the flaps instead. Okay, this is something called an execution error. Now, as we know, the flaps were properly extended and never were retracted, so that initial execution error hypothesis was disproven. However, that doesn't mean another execution error is impossible. It's quite possible that the transcript could say something like, positive rate, gear up. Why did you cut off? I didn't cut off. Okay. If that's the case, then this would very likely indicate an execution error. Now, there are several major arguments that people raise against execution errors. But we have seen execution errors down several aircraft. Most recently, I'm just going to mention two because these do happen somewhat frequently. These are all low probability events, right? So we're rating improbable causes by least improbable to most improbable. So the first one that I'd mention is the Swiftair flight 5960 crash in Vilnius in November 2024. Now, this crash was one that made the headlines as possible Russian sabotage. And 5 months later, when the preliminary report came out, it turned out that what had happened was the pilot monitoring, I believe, had reached up and flipped off the hydraulics pumps instead of flipping on the engine anti-ice, and consequently without any hydraulics pressure, when they went to set the flaps, nothing happened, and eventually they crashed because they didn't have flaps. Second one is Yeti Air Flight 691 that crashed in Pokhara, Nepal in 2023. And in this particular case, you had a pilot certifying captain sitting in the right-hand seat, which is normally where the first officer sits. Captains usually sit in the left-hand seat. That's important here. And when he was asked to set the flaps by the pilot flying, who was sitting in the left-hand seat, captain flying in the left-hand seat, so it was a flight with two captains, he reached over and pulled the wrong lever and feathered the propellers instead of setting the flaps. And while the flaps mistake was eventually corrected with no discussion, the propellers were never unfeathered, and so the flight eventually stalled and crashed, killing all on board. To my knowledge, nobody accuses that of being a murder-suicide case. So this is what in these two cases, we're talking about something called executive error, and in particular, something called a slip. You go to do one thing, you do something else. So the major arguments here are that the major argument against this that I've seen is that the preliminary report does not mention that this was inadvertent, while, of course, in the Swiftair case they did. However, as I say, I don't see evidence in this preliminary report that they have begun to try to build causal relationships between every piece of information they have. So what this means to me is that the investigators may just simply have not gotten that far. Secondly, it's important to note that the preliminary report in the Swiftair crash took 5 months to come out, while in this case, it came out in about a little over a month. So the investigation in this case is not nearly as far advanced as it was in the Swiftair case, and consequently, I don't think you can draw a lot of parallels between the two preliminary reports. So what would obviously disprove this theory to me, because I believe it's the most likely, would be if the cockpit voice recorder had something other than positive rate, gear up, why did you cut off, right? The second point here is that you can read a lot of things back and forth. You can say, I didn't cut off as a denial, as a way of, oh, I caught you. No. More likely, though, this can be, as I say, a lack of memory of having done what you've done. You meant to do one thing, you did something else. You remember what you intended to do, not what you did. And I think in many cases, we all have cases where we've made these sorts of execution errors. Now, it's really important to point out here that execution errors happen. They are rare. They do happen. And they are not necessarily an individual's fault. These are basically, you can think of them as glitches that happen within our brains. We sometimes call them brain farts. Okay? Although brain farts can be a wider range of errors than just that. So in suggesting that this is an execution error, one is not necessarily arguing that it's a lack of training or a lack of procedures or a lack of following procedures by the pilots. It very well could be, again, meaning to do one thing and actually doing something else. Now, the second argument that people make about this is that the flap handle and the landing gear handle are in fact much closer to each other than than say the landing gear handle and the fuel cutoff switches, right? So it's more likely that you're going to flip something, you're going to do something that's near something else than something that's further, and that's a fair point, right? But the problem with the slip is that these don't have to be spatially related to each other, right? There's a video that I will provide a link to in the description, which shows a man ironing a shirt. His cell phone rings, he grabs the iron, he puts it up to his ear, and burns himself, right? That's a classic execution error, right? There's no indication the cell phone was near where the iron was, but he evidently had the iron on his mind, and so that's what he reached for and grabbed. So what could cause the pilot to have the fuel switches on his mind? There are, since the first officer was one flying, if the person who would have raised the landing gear would have been the captain, the pilot monitoring, right? And in this particular case, the captain was about to retire. He was about to retire in order to take care of his aging father. Okay? This is probably a very emotional, very likely stressful time. And while people may read that also as maybe some sort of despondency that might lead to a pilot murder-suicide, that's not necessarily the case here, right? So it could be the case that, this is one of his final flights. He's thinking about it in those terms. That he's not going to be flying much longer, and there could be a lot of time that he's thinking, okay, I'm going to be at the gate this last time, shutting off the engines and walking away from the airplane. And if that's something that's been on his mind a lot, it would be very closely expected that if there's a slip, his hands might go to the fuel cutoff switches instead of to whatever he's intending to do. So what I'm trying to get at here is that the investigation is going to have to look at all three of these possibilities, and they'll have to look at them fairly carefully. I see no evidence that the investigation is at the point where they've drawn the kinds of causal connections that would allow them to determine exactly which one of these is is the probable cause. However, when you look at crashes that happen from slips, they're almost always happening at high workload phases of flight. And the thing here is that you have a highly choreographed, basically set of motions. Positive rate, gear up. You go and raise the gear. The ability to interrupt that in order to crash the airplane with the other person there present, we haven't ever seen that before. Okay? We haven't ever seen that before. We've seen pilot murder-suicides before, but we've never seen one happening right at takeoff. Okay? Because that requires breaking out of that highly choreographed phase and collaborative workload and getting into that mood and making that decision that you're finally going to do it. Doing that would take a lot of effort. It would take practice. And consequently, there would need to be reasons to think that this specific mode had been pre-planned, pre-practiced, and done ahead of time. Because, I mean, when you're busy, you don't suddenly have them go, oh, screw this, I'm going to go kill myself. That's not how things work when you are busy, right? Yeah. And I don't care how suicidal you are. People don't commit suicide in the middle of in the middle of doing something else, right? So, in my mind, those are the things which make that make execution error far more likely than pilot murder-suicide. Now, the last point I want to make about this is that while aviation has made huge gains in terms of understanding and preventing human error, the fact that this is still possible, that we've seen with Swift Air, with Yeti Air, and possibly with this case, indicates that there's still, that this is still the final frontier in aviation safety, and it's still the final frontier in a lot of other areas of safety too, including medicine, IT, rail operations, nuclear power plant operations, etc. There's still a lot that we don't know in terms of what we can do to further reduce these errors beyond where they are now. And there are cases where we can look at things. We can look at the Yeti crash and we can say, okay, they didn't follow these procedures and this increased their risk of error, right? But we can't say that with the Swift Air crash, and we can't say that at this point with this crash. So this is a stark reminder that there is still progress to be made. Finally, on the question of that everybody was probably asking of, is it still safe to fly? Aviation safety has taken a pretty big hit in the last couple of years. I don't think there's any denying that, but flying is so ridiculously safe that Degrading this much still makes it ridiculously safe. Not as ridiculously safe as it was a few years ago, but it's still pretty darn ridiculously safe. I believe, if I remember right, flying is the second safest means of travel, right behind trains. Okay? Trains are safest per passenger kilometer. Flights are a close second. And then, like, you'd have to increase the number of accidents, 20 times, 30 times, maybe 50 times over before you get to something that's anywhere as dangerous as driving on the highway. So, those are these thoughts. I look forward to seeing what the final report actually shows and what they decide. As I say, this is, at this point, inference from incomplete information, but while we are entitled to our own readings of the facts, we are not entitled to our own facts, right? Which means that saying, well, immediately thereafter, adding a couple of seconds is wrong, right? So, the aircraft stops accelerating because the switches are pulled, or unless something else suddenly happened. And consequently, if you're adding seconds there, you're adding you're adding errors that don't make sense. So I'm going to go ahead and paste to put links to some of these other just videos in the description. I hope you find this useful, and I hope you all have a great week.